Welcome to today's training, Building Your First Batch Macro. This is a very difficult topic to simplify, and I've tried to do it the best that I can, but if I could get some understanding along the way, that'd be as great as possible. Because the batch macro, the difficult thing about it is it's hard to understand when to use it. And that's what we're going to talk about today, when to use it. And the interesting thing is that many times you could accomplish what you need a batch macro for using other types of macros or other processes. So I just might show you a candidate from community, community.alteryx.com, who asked a question. He was having a problem, and I solved his problem using a batch macro. So we're going to review a simple use case and then go over my solution to that and how you'd build it. So what we're going to cover here during this session today that will span the next hour is some of the upcoming trainings, some workflow background to understand really what goes into a batch macro, how does it behave. Then we'll jump into the designer and go ahead and start building our batch macro for the first time. And then finally, support. If you'd like to follow along with today's training, that very same page that you came through to get to this WebEx today has at the very bottom a starting workflow and a completed workflow. These should be compatible with versions 10.0 and above. So if you want to follow along and build along, you can download the starting workflow, or if you just want the whole completed workflow and just click and follow along and view the configuration, you can do that as well. So those two are available to you as resources. And as always, we post the video as a follow-up right here to the community. So if I skip through something that seemed to be going very fast and you want to take time to review and scrub through the video, that playback will be available later today. Okay, so upcoming trainings. Next week is a really fun training. If you've been using Alteryx for a while now, we're going to talk about some things that you may never have known. And a lot of these are just with user experience or user interface, things that you might not necessarily knew you could do within Designer that will provide development shortcuts. So not really necessarily about the process, but more about these little hidden gems within the tool themselves. And then following the week after that, we're going to round off our macro series. So 2 weeks ago, we did standard macros. This week is batch. And then in May, we're going to finish with iterative macros. If you have any questions or want to look at other trainings, we encourage everybody to go to community. You can find it at community.alteryx.com. You can go there and sign up. There you can ask your questions, get them answered quickly, see all of our trainings that you've seen here today, and then earn your reputation and rewards. So we have things that are really popular right now, like weekly challenges, where people can go in and try to build their own macro, which is actually happening this week. If you go to our training section, within weekly challenges, you'll see that there's a challenge to package wine bottles in 6, 12, or 96 bottle cases. So you can go ahead and look at those if you want to try to put your knowledge into action today. So background for today's training. So 2 weeks ago, I spoke about standard macros, and I'm going to try to do it in a vacuum. But for those of you who don't know, what is a macro? Why do I need a macro, and why do I need to understand the types of macros? Sometimes a process needs to be done in Alteryx repeatedly and can consume long periods of time. Or you may be using lots of tools to do it, and you don't want to redo it over and over and over again. A macro is a great way of packaging up a set of tools and making it essentially, visibly, one tool that you can use to configure how your workflow should run. So it's really valuable when you think from the aspect of an organization. If they're all running the same process to report on the same analytics, you could create that macro and share it with everybody so everybody gets the same analytics. So we're going to understand what types are out there, why we're choosing batch today, and how you'd accomplish a batch macro. So this is essentially, this little screenshot you see here is going to be the first batch macro that we built today. As simple as can be, really between the two macro input and output, there's one tool with a control parameter filling it in. We'll give you more color on that later, but this is what we're going to be covering today. So again, what is that macro? Here's a great example of a macro inside of Designer, the Count Records tool. If I pull my Designer in, Let me just open a new instance here. There we go. And I go to my Count Records tool. You'll see when I drag it in, I get this little plus sign. If you do not see that, that's because I have a special interface option that I've chosen to show what tools are macros and what are not. So in this case, I have my transpose, which is not a macro, but my count records that is. If you're curious to actually have that displaying, you can go to Options, User Settings, Edit User Settings. There, if you go to the Canvas tab, at the very bottom, you'll see this little check mark that says Display Macro Indicators. Okay. By default, I have checked that so I can see what is a macro. Now, if I want to see what a macro really is, if I right-click on it, you see that I have this option to open a macro. So really what's happening in our Count Records tool is it's a series of tools set up to complete some sort of task. And that's all macros really is. It's creating a tool via a set of many different tools to create a shortcut in your process, something that you'll know you'll do again and again. In this case, we know a lot of people will count records, so we built that into a macro and packaged it up with Alteryx. So at a very basic level, that's a macro, and that's a standard macro. Really, we've just minimized it. And all the behavior is that of a normal workflow, right? It runs left to right. So if you would like to distinguish between those types of macros, I think this is a really great slide for understanding that, right? So our Count Records tool was a standard macro. It was essentially a typical workflow that was a packaged up set of tools, okay? And when you run it, it runs through that set of tools once, and it's done. The other two are a little bit more complicated, and it depends on your background, but for me, I find batch to be actually the most difficult type of macro to understand. So what is a batch macro? Well, it is a packaged set of tools, but there's a certain behavior of how that packaged set of tools behaves. Instead of running one process for all pieces of your data set, the batch macro can actually parcel up your data set into chunks based on your some sort of configuration and process those one at a time. So, for example, let's say I'm working with stores, right? I could set some sort of parameter for my batch macro to run only one store at a time and create essentially a batch. You could think of this as somewhat of a group by within our designer or a for each. And that will become a little bit more clear when we start demonstrating how that behaves inside a designer and how to achieve that. Finally, we have iterative. So this is essentially for those from a programming background, this is your for loop. You keep rerunning the same workflow over and over and over and over again until you reach a desired result. An example would be, right, if I had a penny at the beginning of the month and I wanted to double it, the amount I had every day, so it was 1 penny on day 1, 2 pennies on day 2, 4 on day 3. I could use an iterative macro to run it through 31 times, doubling it each time to see what my final result is. That's an example of an iterative macro. So it's a repeating process, and usually you set some sort of threshold, right? Do I want it to end at 30 days, or do I want to end when that penny reaches $1 million, and how many days does it take to achieve that? That would be my iterative macro. So let's look at a batch macro. So I'm going to show you quickly a very logical background of how it behaves, and then we'll go in and build a simple one ourselves. Okay. So when you build a batch macro, essentially the one thing that defines a batch macro, that makes it a batch macro, is it not only has a macro input and output, but it has a control parameter, which looks like this. Okay. When you have a control parameter, what happens to your macro is you get this little upside down question mark as an input, which basically says, how do you want me to batch through your records? Okay. So in this case, we have some configurations that we have to take care of for each batch macro, and they'll all be very common. Okay. So first we have the question tab, and it chooses what value you want to read in. So in this case, we have some sort of field from this data set called type, We want to read that into our batch macro. On the other tab, we have group by, which says, how do we want to group our data coming into this record, either for the control group or the field input? And I know this may seem a little hazy yet, but it'll be better defined once we get in the workflow. But when you choose the group by tab, you can choose to group by nothing or group by a specific field. If you group by nothing, it'll tend to have a behavior of an append. If you group by something, it'll have the behavior of a join. So what do I mean by that? So let's go ahead and look at these two data sets a little closer. Okay. In the top data set, I have 4 records. Each have a type A, B, C, D. And then down here, I have a second data set with 3 type A's, first, second, third, 3 type B's, fourth, fifth, sixth, and 3 type C's. Okay. In this case, I've chosen a control group by field of nothing, saying I don't want them to essentially group on each other. I don't want there to be any sort of sensitivity around what type this is and what type this is. So how many batches will run? Well, the secret is the amount of batches that will run will be what's contained within this data set that goes into the control parameter. In this case, we have 4 values. So we can expect 4 different batches to run through here. Now, how many records will we have on each run? So this is where this group by logic becomes really important. If I'm not choosing to group by, all of my records will run against type A. If I choose to group on type A and group on type A, then type A will match to each other and only run for that instance. So we're going for the instance, though, where it's none, right? There's no matching criteria. So what's going to happen is that essentially 4 different batches are going to run through and create a data set. The first batch, you can see here, is all for the value of A. And you can see that I have the fields first through 9th. So essentially, the value of A appeared on every single value within here. Now you can see that was the first batch. The second batch comes through, batch B, and it runs for 1st through 9th. Okay, 1st through 9th. Batch C, 1st through 9th. D, 1st through 9th. So really what this ended up being was a pure multiplier of how many records we have in this data set for the control parameter, how many batches, and how many records we had down here, for a total of 36 records. 9 times 4, 36. What if we want to control those batches a little better, though? What we can do is set that group by to match up. So if I want my control group to group on type for both data sets, so you can see I have my control group by type, field input type. What's going to happen is all 4 of those batches will still run, but instead of matching it against all of the records at the same time, it will just pull the appropriate batch. So what does that mean? So let's look at what happens in this behavior. So my first batch, A, is going to run into my control parameter and request all A's from my other data set. So now my batch is consuming only 3 records, and they get output as part of a data set. Now, if I move on to run 2, you can see my type B filters in. I pull in the next 3 records, and it gets appended to my data set. Run 3, same behavior. I run the type C in. It asks for all the type C's from the input data set, and I have 3 output. What happens on type D? Well, we have no records in type D from our data set, so really it's not going to match against anything. So really, it's just not going to process those because there's nothing appropriate for that batch. Okay. Now, what we're really missing here is a really good use case. Okay. What we've really done is just shown the behavior how this works, grouping versus non-grouping. But we're going to show some examples here of how to make this a little bit better. So let's start with the most simplest form that we can. Cancel out of these 2. What I'm going to go to is my starting workflow and download that. While I'm waiting for this to load, are there any questions? Feel free to put any of your questions into the Q&A. I tend to monitor that a little closer than the chat. So if you have any questions at this point, please let me know. Okay, so if you've downloaded the starting workflow, this is what you're seeing right now. I have 3 text input tools. So let's go ahead and build our very first batch macro. I'm going to delete some of these comment boxes because that's just to provide context for my solution here. So if we look at these 2 data sets, you'll see that I have one with a record ID and a multiplier, and a second one with a record ID and a number. In essence, I want to run these 2 input data through a batch macro to multiply number by the multiplier and output those into one single data set. So how would I do that? Well, let's go ahead and build our first macro. And what I'd recommend you do is go to this bottom data set that would represent your main data. These would be the batches because we're batching by each multiplier. Go into your main data set, right-click, and copy that. We're going to open a new workflow. What we're going to do is paste that new text tool in there and right-click, convert to macro input. Now, by converting to macro input, the behavior of this file has already changed. By default, all our files are saved as YXMD, but as soon as you change this to a macro input, it becomes a different file type. It becomes a YXMC, and we talked about that 2 weeks ago. So if I were to click on the white space of my canvas, go to workflow, you can see that I have macro, standard macro. Okay. If I were to toggle back here and observe the same behavior, you can see that I have just standard workflow, which makes sense. But this one is going to be a standard macro. And we're going to leave that alone for now, just so I can demonstrate some behavior. If you know you're going to build a batch macro right away, you could just click this batch macro dropdown and you're good to go. It doesn't change the file type, it just lets the designer know what type of behavior you'd like this macro to have. What I am going to show you though is if you drop in a control parameter, control parameters only exist inside of batch macros. So if I were to drop this onto the canvas, Alteryx is smart enough to recognize that, hey, a control parameter is in here, it definitely has to be a batch macro. No question about it. So you can either toggle it manually, or you could just wait for yourself to drop in that control parameter if you'd like to wait for that. Okay, so let's go in here. Let me rearrange some of these windows here. Okay, so simply I just want to create some sort of multiplier, right? I've got this data set, and maybe I just want to multiply everything by 10, right? Just a random number here. So let's go ahead and multiply our whole data set. I'm going to bring in a formula tool. And if this formula tool looks different from yours, that's because I'm running on version 11. I'm going to call this my product. And I'll say number times 10. One little hint about working with the formula tool that I think is helpful is if you ever just want to search for a field instantly, just use an open bracket and it'll show you all the variables you have available to you instead of showing, if I were just to type in record ID, right, it might take a few more letters to get there and you'll see that I get functions available. But if you just want to open up fields, an open bracket works really well. So I got number times 10. You can see in my data preview, I'd expect my first value to be around 100. Let's run the workflow, and I can see each number is being multiplied by 10. Let's just output this now. So I'm going to look for my macro output. I'm going to name this output. Now, if you missed 2 weeks ago's training, if you ever want to add some sort of indicator on the anchors, like an I or an O, you could do that here. So let's add an I and an O, just for the fun of it, just so we know what that macro is at, input and output. There we go. So let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to save this to my desktop, and I'll call this All right. At this point, this is just a standard macro, right? We don't have a control parameter in here yet. So really, we'd expect the behavior of anything running through here just to be multiplied by 10. So if I want to drop my macro that I've just created into my starting workflow canvas, I can right-click, insert, macro, my live training demo. Okay. Let me just toggle this back here so I can get rid of that question mark. Okay. There we go. So this is a standard macro, right? It's just a bottled up process, and all it's going to do is take any number that goes in and output it as a multiplier of 10. Easy. But what happens if my multiplier varies by some sort of record ID? Right? So my record 1 should only be multiplied by 2 and not by 10. My record 2 should be multiplied by 5 and not by 10. Record 3 by 4 and not by 10. So you can see my conundrum. You could think of this in another way. Let's reword this, right? If I'm working with income tax varies by state. So really this record ID could be some sort of state ID, and this could be my tax rate based on that state. And then this could be a list of my earnings right here with the state ID on it, so I know how much tax to apply to each state. So that's a really good example of how that batch macro might work. So let's go ahead and build in a way to essentially associate this multiplier with the right record inside this data set. So you'll see that I just toggled it back to standard macro, so I'm going to demonstrate once more that control parameter coming in here. I'm going to drag it far away enough that it doesn't connect to anything. I'll just delete that. So there's my control parameter, and really what I'd expect to come into my control parameter is what that multiplier is. So I'll call it multiplier field. There we go. And now I have to choose how that multiplier is going to enter into my data set. Now, you can see my workflow configuration is currently set to number times 10. What I want to do for each batch is update this value of 10. I want it to change to 4, 5, 6 based on the record that's coming in. So I'm going to drag from this little Q input, standing for question, into this action. And really what happens when I drag between the two is this action tool shows up. And the action tool always says, hey, how do you want me to relate the value coming in from this control parameter to the actual tool itself? So in this case, I get to set how it changes this tool. So in this case, I could choose a number of things. I'm going to expand all of these. I could choose to update the expression. I could choose to update the field, the size of the data type, the type of data type. In this case, I really want to update the 10 value. So I'm going to highlight expression-value number times 10. And you'll see down here in the very bottom corner, I have that expression down here. Now what's going to happen is this control parameter is going to replace this value. Now I don't want it to replace the whole value because I still want the number to be multiplied by something. What I really just want to replace is 10. So what I'm going to do is select this replace specific string and delete everything but the 10. The 10 is what I want to change every time that new value comes in. So let's go ahead and save this. And what it's going to do inside this workflow is it's going to say, hey, your macro's changed. I essentially changed it from a standard to a batch. So it's going to ask me to reload it. So I'm just going to reinsert it into my workflow. Okay. So now we have this upside down question mark, which really represents, again, this control parameter, and then the I field, which represents my input macro. So I'm going to pipe my data into my macro, and I'm going to pipe in my batches into the question mark. And I'm going to say, hey, for each record ID, map it to each record ID. Right? So if this is my state ID for my control group, this is the person's state ID that belongs to them for their tax rate. I'm going to choose that multiplier field for my questions. Let's add a browse tool. I'm going to let it run. So now you can see for a record ID of 1, the multiplier of 10 is 20, so it must have been multiplied by 2. You can see that my record 1 only has a multiplier of 2, so that it acted behaved correctly. The next one we have is, we can just observe record 3. You can see it's 4 times the amount. So let's go see what our batch had. 3 had 4 times the amount. So you can see that essentially this batch is coming in and updating based on these record IDs. Now what would happen if I were to remove these groupings, right? Let's go ahead and run this again. What's going to happen is essentially these records are going to run through every batch. So what was our first batch, right? Our first batch was the multiplier of 2. So we can see that record 1 was multiplied by 2, record 2 was multiplied by 2, record 3, all the way through 20. And then what happens is it starts over again. In this case, it's multiplied by 5. So we can see the new batch has begun. We check over here, we can see the multiplier is 5. So that's the behavior of what happens when you choose to have no control groupings or control groupings. Now, many of you out there are probably saying, hey, this is really similar to that of a join or an append. I hear you. That's absolutely correct. You could accomplish the same thing with a join or append. The difference is it's not packageable like this macro is, and this is just to demonstrate the behavior. I'll have a little bit of a better example to show how you might work around something with a batch macro. So I'm going to pause there for a second and see if there's any QA coming in. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions. So let's go on to the next example. Okay. Here's my example. I have 3 stores and I have 4 products. So at store 1, I have $1,300 of product sales, $544 of product B sales, and no sales of C and D. My business rule for this case is if they don't sell anything or that cell is blank, then they just don't sell it at all. They don't have that product in store. Same with 2. You can see that product B has no sales, so they must not be selling that product. And store 3 has all the values. Now, this is a question that I came across when I was working on Community that I thought a batch macro was a really great example of how to get around that. So let's go ahead and say I want to report on each of these stores. This is the point where we cross this problem. For any of you who are familiar with this table tool here, this also has a batch reporting functionality built into it. By selecting each store, what it's going to do on the group by is create one new table for each store. Let's add a browse tool and just observe what happens. So here you can see in my data set, I've created 3 different tables for 3 different stores, so that behaved exactly as I wanted. And I've got 4 columns for each. What if my business didn't really want to see any columns for something I didn't really report on? So for store 1, maybe my table tool should only be selecting product A and product B. For store 2, maybe it should be only selecting product A, product C, and product D. And then for store 3, it should have all of the fields. Inside the basic table tool, there's no real way to specify for what batch of store what fields to select. So what do we need to do? We essentially need to create a rule for each of these stores and batch them through a macro. This is going to be our solution. So let's go ahead and try to build a solution for this one. So I'm going to copy this tool here and paste my data set into here. So the first thing I need to do is create some sort of filter. I really want to prepare a report for one store at a time. That's all I want to do. So I'm just going to go in and drop in a filter tool and say where the store is equal to 1. I just want to work on this one field. All right. I only want to work on one store at a time. I'm going to make sure I convert this to a macro input because it is a macro that I'll be working with. So I want to create some sort of table report on this. Now, you'll see if I just create a table just for this one store right now, the same behavior happens. It's just going to output a table with some blank values. I could certainly remove C and D in this case, whatever my blank ones were. But for store 2, that configuration wouldn't work correctly for that because C and D do exist for that. So you can see that the basic table still doesn't work for me yet. So what I'm going to do is do some trickery here. And if you just want to follow along, I'm just going to transpose my data around so I can remove essentially any fields that are null. I don't want those going into my basic table tool. So I'm going to go ahead and transpose my values. And I'm going to select my store to be my key value, which basically says do not partake in my transpose, but pivot all the other fields. So now you can see my store stayed as a column, and my fields that were previously names of the fields have pivoted into a value, and my data is contained. Now I'm going to add a filter just to remove anything with a null value. So now you see I'm getting closer to where I want to be. I only got the fields that I want to. I just need to make sure that they're back in a table format that I can run into my table tool. So what I need to do is pivot those back, so it's going to be the inverse of what I use for this transpose. I'm going to use a crosstab. And I'm going to group it by store again and say the name should become header and the value should become the value, essentially. So now you can see I've already transformed from the beginning, where I had all 4 columns. I flipped it, removed the nulls, flipped it back, and now I'm back to a point where I just have the 2 fields that I want. Now, the crosstab tool has a little bit of a behavior where it renames anything with blank space to underscores. So I'm just going to update that to get it back into the original state. So if you've never used this tool before, you'll find it extremely helpful, the dynamic rename. So this allows me to update all of my field names all at once based on some sort of criteria. So I'm going to choose formula from my drop-down and say apply this formula to all the fields. And what I want to do is replace any instance of an underscore with some sort of space. So I'm going to say replace character for the current field, and anything with an underscore, turn it into a space. You're asking me, what does current field mean if you're incurring this for the first time? Essentially, current field represents any of these values. So it's going to run the same expression for store, product A, and product B. In this case, it probably won't do anything for store because there's no space value, but it will change A and B. Now you can see that we're really in a good place. Everything is renamed as it should be. And I'm going to drop a table in here now. So now if I were to group this by store, which I could do, in this case, I know that my batch is going to do that grouping. It won't affect it because it's only one store, really. Let me get back to my report here. You can see that I'm now just reporting on that value, right? And no matter what I change this value to for store 2, it's going to dynamically update it just to include the fields that have values within them. So let's go ahead and create a macro output just to finish this off so we can observe that within our data set. Okay. Remove this browse here. And we'll go ahead and save this. So okay. So the only downside of this workflow as it is right now is that if I insert it, it's a standard macro, right? Currently, it's hard-coded to really only produce for table 2, because that's where my filter is sitting. But I need it to reproduce for each batch, okay? So what I'm going to do is set up a control saying, hey, for each store, run this batch each time. So I'm going to drag this down, bring in a control parameter, and connect it in here to my store equals 2. I want the store number to update this value each time. So I'm going to go in and update what I want to change. In this case, I'm going to highlight the value of 2. And you can see down here it's just highlighting the value of 2 itself. Thankfully, it's very simple in terms of the operand. So we don't have to update the specific string. We just know that 2 will always get updated with if 1 pipes in or 2 or 3 or whatnot. So we'll save this yet again. And you can see that if I go back to my workflow, my batch macro has now been hard-coded because that control parameter is in here. I'm going to enter a label for my control parameter. So choose store a field. Save that. And I'll go back to my starting workflow, which again gives me that warning that something has changed, so I need to update it. Okay. So what's going to be my data? Well, we know this is going to be my data going in. And this one is a little interesting because it really uses itself as a data set. In this case, I'm saying, hey, I want the store value to run for each batch of itself. So group store by store. I want to make sure that it runs, store 1 only runs for store 1. And the store that I want to batch on is based on this store field. So if I add to browse, you can see that this batch output now has run 3 times for each of my different batches that came in, store 1, store 2, store 3. And for each of those stores, it's only given you the fields that exist within that macro. So you can see it only has product A and B for store 1, whereas if I had just used my basic table tool, it would have included them. So by using a batch process, I was able to circumnavigate some of the functionalities that I wanted from this basic table, but I was able to do it with this batch macro tool. Now, anything that I've built here today is available on the community. Again, you can go ahead and download that solution if you want to go ahead and observe that behavior. But if you were to walk away from this training today, the big thing that I want you to understand is, A, the behavior, which I think we've touched on, grouping versus non-grouping, and really understanding when to use it, right? The hard thing about batch macros and Alteryx in general is there's so many ways to successfully get to an answer. It's a good problem to have because it allows for creativity. Batch by many can be seen as an optimization technique. In this case, this particular functionality can only be solved through a macro. So I can't update anything within this configuration to make this work, and it would be painful to create 3 different table tools to create the final output, especially if we're working with hundreds of different stores, right? So I could shortcut that whole process by creating this batch macro. Okay. So if you have any questions beyond today's training around batch macros, there's some great examples on community. So we recommend a lot of people go there. This playback will be posted there. So if I was going a little fast and you want to figure out more about batch macros, you can go ahead and go there. If you have any issues along the way that you think merit further support, we recommend you email support@alteryx.com. After the survey today, we'll be redirecting you, after this training today, I'm sorry, we'll be redirecting you to a survey the reason that I'm running this macro series is it was in such high demand based on this survey. So if you really want to see something as part of the future trainings here on Community, you can go ahead and vote there, and it allows me to make decisions in the future what we should run based on demand. And then also you can tell me how effective this was for you. It is a very difficult topic to address, and maybe it gave you enough to kickstart you into the world of batch macros and what's possible with them. Let me know how we did. So thank you for joining today. I'm going to go back and hang around for a few minutes and answer any Q&A along the way. And if not, if you want to head out, that's great. Thank you for joining, and we'll talk soon.